Welcome back. We are Gentlemen United, and you are in the man cave. The show topic today is show up, produce, and die on time. Now, this is a sarcastic phrase used to encapsulate the concept of male disposability, which is a topic that most are still unfamiliar with. What is it? Does it exist? Is it the product of toxic masculinity and the patriarchy? So McCall Jones is a researcher, writer, public speaker, and coach. His more than 15 years in advertising helped him understand that the power of communication has helped corporations make billions of dollars, is equally as available to every individual on the planet. He is the founder of the Institute for Adult Communication, an organization dedicated to researching how people use language to navigate their lives, how to use a language, how the use of language differs from person to person, and he looks at how people have vastly different results in their lives based on how they speak. A large portion of his research and training is focused on specific differences in how most men and most women communicate their needs and desires. He's created training programs dedicated to specific breakdowns in how people speak, and as a result has helped people make more money, have more satisfying relationships, and achieve more overall confidence and effectiveness in their lives. McCall has led his programs around the world and now has begun a multi-year examination of what exactly masculinity is, the state of masculinity in Western society, and identifying what he can do to help address the state of men and begin to rebuild how men think about and manage themselves and identify man's true role in his own life, society, and the world. Trigger warning. If discussing topics like male disposability is going to offend you, I'll pause for a moment and invite you to stop watching right now and go on to the next YouTube clip. This will likely be too much for some to handle. All right, now with that out the way, we can get on with the show. All right. As always, for those watching this live broadcast on YouTube, feel free to add your comments and questions in the comment bar. I'll watch for them, and we'll get to them time permitting. Joining me tonight all the way from California is McCall Jones, and of course, you, our viewers. I'm Sean Best. McCall, welcome. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Sean, so much for having me. Good to be here.
That's fantastic to have you here. I know that you and I have met each other on Facebook and have been back and forth for it's got to be almost a year now. We've
yeah, that's
I think
true.
It's been about a year, and I've been wanting to interview you forever. And I saw a topic that came up, and we said, okay, we've got to do this one. This is worth the conversation. So we're definitely going to make this happen. So McCall, tell us a bit about the Institute for Adult Communication. Now, who is your target audience, and what your interaction with your clients looks like? Is it an audience, a group of people in the room? Is it one-on-one? Is it a webinar? Is it a combination of them? Like, what exactly is the Institute for Adult Communication, and what does it look like when you're, servicing your clients?
All right, in practice. It started off with basically the target audience being myself. I had this dream of basically having this think tank and the ability to train other people. I had stumbled across this topic as a topic in terms of how men and women interact with each other, how men and women individually think of themselves. And I'd been taking lots of other programs that each offered tremendously valuable insights and tremendously valuable coaching, but they still weren't tying it all together. And I would randomly speak to people, and they would constantly, like on a regular basis, multiple people in multiple countries, really comment on how I had synthesized this information in ways that they had never actually heard before. And over time, I thought they were just blowing smoke. I mean, I was hearing hundreds and hundreds of different speakers, and I was seeing dozens of them and meeting, and some of them became my mentors and my own personal coaches. And I started to take seriously that maybe I do have a different take on this. Maybe there is something that's unique in the way that I see how these relationships go and how communication goes. And maybe I can step up and be some kind of contribution. And I didn't want to just be, McCall Jones, public speaker. I said, I really want this to live beyond myself if it has a chance to do that. So I decided to start an organization and named it the Institute for Adult Communication, because I really think that there's a distinction between the way that children communicate and the way that adults communicate in terms of effectiveness and what results as a result of those communications. So I put that together, and I wanted to also do a tremendous amount of my own research and writing, because I just had this voracious appetite for this information. I never knew what it would become. It starts off as one of those fluke situations where it's like, this is really interesting. I'll read this one book I just found. And literally, I read the book, and 4 years later, I'm still just as voraciously sucking down all this information as I did 4 years prior, and now it's 17 years later.
Wow.
So it's been quite a journey. It started in Germany, and I brought it back with me here, and it's just been an amazing journey. And I'm thankful for the radio shows, and I teach part of my programs in a university in Taipei. So this will coming up in April will be my 5th year going to teach my program there, and the students are very open and very willing to listen, and it makes a huge difference for them. And I'm excited. I love to travel, and I get to go back, and that's always a very happy thing. But I think most important is the realization that I'm actually helping people and I'm really making a difference. And sometimes that making the difference is hard. I mean, it's a very interesting time right now in our societies, and specifically Western society, in terms of people's opinions about themselves, about society, about men and women. And I started off with what works versus what doesn't work. And I found that much of the conversation that's going on in the popular culture simply doesn't work. And we're being forced to accept it. We are living and experiencing the consequences of accepting a conversation that doesn't work. And unfortunately, I'm observing that everyone's suffering. Everyone's debilitated. Everyone's suffering. Everyone's less than they otherwise could be. And we can spend the next 2-3 hours on the distinct and specific consequences of this broken conversation. But we're here today to talk about what that looks like specifically for men.
Yes, and when I started doing this sort of research you're talking about, not quite the same topics, but just on the relationship between men and women. Mm-hmm. It's like one of those things when you pull a thread in a sweater and you keep pulling it and there's just more. It seems like it's an endless thread. Yep. And the colors change. Like, oh, this is blue now. This is green, and and it's one of those things where once you start, like you said, sucking out that information, it becomes one of those things where you have to just a voracious appetite for it. The more you learn, the more you want to learn. So
yeah,
I can totally relate to that. So McCall, the topic of the show is show up, produce, and die on time. Mm-hmm. Very intriguing title. So for those who don't understand what this means, can you take a minute and elaborate what that means to you? What does that phrase mean to you?
Sure. You mentioned it was sarcastic, going into the top of the show, and I just want to sort of pause and let you know that there's nothing about it that I found to be sarcastic.
It's quite accurate, actually.
Right. And the fact that you read the dynamic of male disposability into it is quite important. I was looking at what matters because, as I'm sure most of your listeners know, there's this huge conversation going on about the quote unquote changing role of masculinity and the state of masculinity and masculinity in crisis. And of course, the favorite word of toxic masculinity. And I started to look at that, very, very seriously. And I said, well, what is the role of men? What was the role? I mean, I'm 53 right now. So what was the role of men when I was younger versus what's the role of men now? What was the role in my father's generation? What was the role of men in my grandfather's generation? And looking back, and now even with this sort of equality happening, women I see in popular culture are still demanding that men pay for first dates, and that men get out there and stand up and be tough and be strong. When 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, the conversation was about men need to be more sensitive and men need to be more willing to share their emotions. And I observed that really wasn't working. Women weren't happy when men do that by and large, even though people, encourage men to be more sensitive and share more. When I actually did it, it was the worst possible thing I could have done. The look in a woman's eyes when she loses respect for you is probably the most devastating thing I've ever gotten to observe, and it was the direct result of.
You can't ever get it back once it's gone.
And you cannot get it back, and it's not part of the conversation. So what I began to recognize was not only are these 3 steps in line with masculine instinct, they're also in line with feminine instinct as well. So in other words, I couldn't see any difference between a man applying it and a woman being a consumer of it, and having them disagree on any one of those 3 points. Now, the first point is to show up. And if you actually listen to a lot of these popular conversations, especially the complaints that a lot of women have right now, is they say that men don't show up. So I took that to heart and I said, okay, what does that really look like and what's really going on here? Well, Woody Allen, is famous for his phrase that 97% of success is showing up. So in a lot of ways, I can credit that first step with a clarity for myself to Woody Allen for basically knowing. I mean, it's remarkably simple, but he's absolutely right. 97% of success is showing up. Now, he's currently in sort of politically correct or incorrect social hot water right now, but it doesn't make his statement any less correct. So I took a look at that. And what does that mean? It means that we have to prepare. It means that we have to study. It means that we have to commit ourselves. It means that we have to dive into whatever endeavor. If we're engineers, or if we're air conditioning technicians, if we are janitors, if we are pilots, no matter what we're doing, if we're radio show hosts, that our job is to become an expert in whatever we're doing to the maximum of our ability so that we can apply those skills and apply that experience to the world, because that's how we produce value as men. We have no intrinsic value. We have only the value that we produce in the world that either we can consume and that allows us to eat at night, or that other people consume that allows them to eat at night. So that's why the Elon Musks are so important to the world. That's why the Howard Hugheses are so important to the world. That's why the Nikola Teslas and the Thomas Edisons are so important to the world, because they produce, because just before they produce, they show up. They choose to take the risk. They choose to participate. They choose to, at least at a minimum, attempt to make a difference. One of the metaphors that I really got, I'm sure you saw the movie King Kong.
I did.
You know that scene in the movie when they get to that giant log in the jungle and King Kong starts to shake the tree and some of them fall off?
Yeah.
And I realized that in life, we take on a risk. And that risk is this giant, dark, dangerous unknown. And in this movie, the metaphor was King Kong.
Right.
Also an interesting metaphor for the female psyche, but I'll get back to that later.
Yeah,
so we're all
story,
on this log. It's a whole other story, but they overlapped. So this bunch of guys showed up. They end up on this island, and now this risk that they took on is shaking them. It's tearing them apart. Some of them are falling. So what I realized was, you may begin your personal journey, and you may begin this personal journey with colleagues and friends and partners. But here's the deal: not everybody gets to get back to New York.
Right.
But
Some people don't make it back.
Some people don't make it back to New York. So that's the first part. You have to show up. Right? It's like some people might use the sports analogy. You have to be on the court to be able to win or lose. You have to be on the court. So that's showing up. Part two is to produce. Now, as much as we want now in our modern age men to be sort of better fathers or more emotionally connected, the science is actually really clear on this, that those things are not actually helping us. They are actually sapping us of our testosterone. They're sapping us of our motivation. And ultimately, they're sapping us of our drive and our mission. And therefore, we're sort of sinking into the background of our lives. And now we have an entire generation of young men who are still living basically in their parents' basements. Mm-hmm. And that's epidemic. The other dark side is that we also have an epidemic of male suicides, that basically the mainstream sort of conversation is extremely reluctant to actually address. They would much rather ignore it and pretend that it doesn't exist. And I want to cover that shortly in terms of what I believe that dynamic actually, is going on there. But, to produce is to make a difference. It could be an idea. It doesn't have to be a rocket ship company. It doesn't have to be an electric car. It could be a new way to plane wood. It could be a new kind of nail. It doesn't have to be a massive thing. It's something that makes a difference. Right. But our job is to produce. So when they say suck it up, I think it is a gross distortion of what that actually means. We have no excuse. There's no one that's going to give us any leeway if we don't produce.
Right.
Our wives leave us. They won't be with us in the first place. Our kids lose heart. We get fired from our jobs if we don't produce. Right. End of the story. And there's no part B to that, right?
There's no other alternative to that.
And there literally isn't. And I looked high and low to say, is there anything? There's nothing. Yeah. If we can't produce as men, we get sick. It is in us to be healthy and strong, to be able to produce. We were given these, whether you believe in God or not, we were at least given these attributes to use and use in the world. And if we don't use them, we will literally lose them, and we will lose ourselves in the process.
I mean, how many
So the
times do you
third,
hear that story where, somebody retires after working for 50 years and they can't wait to retire, and 2 weeks after they retire, drop dead?
they're dead. That's exactly right. And that was and what you just said there is a huge component into what had me realize this trilogy, because I was like, wait a minute, once men can no longer produce, wow, there's something different. I spoke in front of a group of professional sort of elder care professionals, and there was a woman there saying that she had assigned her dad to an assisted living facility, and he was really nasty. He was just really mean. But I was doing what's in his best interest. And I listened to her. And this is a room of actually it's about 75 people. And she was saying that he was all mean and nasty. And I said, well, what did your father do before, before his retirement and before he's headed into this assisted living facility? He says, well, he was a very powerful CEO and an executive. And he had a lot of people running around doing things for him,
Right.
And I said, well, he had a leadership role. He had a very important position. And now you're saying he's angry because now his life is completely outside his own control. Other people control every facet of his existence.
Right.
If somebody took away your control of every single facet of your existence, even to the point of where you will live, would you be happy with that yourself?
Right.
And she finally stopped and she realized, wow, I never looked at it that way. I said, I invite you to consider looking at it that way, because your father has lived in a world, not that he was, quote unquote, in charge, but he had responsibility. He had accountability. That's what drives men. Power doesn't necessarily drive men. Power is a precipitate. Power is a result of our being accountable, of taking on responsibility, of working and fighting to protect other people, including our families and our colleagues. And she was just blown away. And there were other men in the room, and some women were going, yeah, I really get that. I get that that's the difference.
Right.
So,
and we're gonna get to accountability in a minute. So don't go too far on the accountability. We're gonna touch on that in a minute.
Perfect. So the last part of this is this dynamic of dying on time. Now, for a very long time, I mean, probably a half a year had passed when I just had these first two. Instinctively, for me, it wasn't complete, but I couldn't figure out what the third piece was. The more that I looked at it, all I had to start doing was watching some Charlton Heston movies from the 70s, where he dies at the end of all these movies. And I was like, huh. And then I just kept watching, and I kept thinking, and I kept watching. And then somebody mentioned that Titanic, everybody knows the story that it's about a giant boat that sinks. But it also became, and it had been made, 4 or 5 times before. But this time we have a dynamic where it becomes the single most profitable motion picture ever released. And that was a big clue, because at the end of the movie, and the analysis has been pretty comical in terms of whether this was necessary or not, but at the end of the movie, Leonardo DiCaprio makes himself a human icicle, freezes, and then basically sinks off, and it allows her to live.
Right.
And I began to look at that as it relates to male disposability as a very common theme to what is inextricably linked to the first two steps. That in spite of what sacrifices we make to prepare and then show up, in spite of what sacrifices we might make to ultimately produce at all costs, the third part is we also have to be willing to sacrifice it all by laying our lives down for our families and our colleagues when the time comes. And in reality, it might be an if the time comes dynamic. But at the end of the day, that is part of the trilogy. In other words, when we accept the mantle of showing up and producing, we are also inherently accepting the mantle of dying on time. And that, as hard as it was for me to accept, was the one that made it all work. And I have not been able to find any logical fractures in that trilogy at all.
Wow. Now, that sounds kind of depressing. So let me think. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I want to offer this. I thought it was also depressing when I first stumbled across it. But the more that I thought about it, the more energized I actually felt. Because it basically put the full circle on every single man's life, from birth to death. We were all born and we're all going to die. What do you do in the middle that's going to make a difference?
That's right.
right? So
Mhm.
as long as you can accept that at the end of the day, you may have to sacrifice yourself, it's actually quite relieving because you have a mission. You can make a difference. You can make a difference for yourself, and you can make a difference for the people that you care about. So I actually found it an incredibly liberating realization at the end of the day versus the depressing interpretation that most people and I myself had at first blush.
Well, you know what? That's interesting that you pointed out that way because you think about it this way. Um, and when you position it that way, it makes sense. We all have to die, right? So we can either spend our time sitting here, doing this, or we can actually do something meaningful. Um,
Right.
but when you think about it, it's you said just now it was energizing for a man, and I can see how that would be energizing for men. Not so much a dying on time, but at some point you have to die on time. You have to die. It's having a purpose, having a focus, having a function. And I've
Mm-hmm.
had this conversation in different with different other friends of mine who are men, and who at times in their lives, myself included, where you just kind of felt like you were sitting in a life raft in the middle of the ocean with at nighttime with no moonlight and no land in sight, and you're just kind of floating around. You felt like I'm not going anywhere. I don't know what I'm doing.
Mm-hmm.
And the having a purpose or a goal or a function, something to do, it's energizing. It's
Yes.
empowering. Now, I guess my
Yep.
question to you is this: given your interaction with both sexes, um, do you find that same degree, that same response of I feel energized, I have a purpose, I have a function, and the dying on time part is just sort of the exclamation mark. There you go, stamp, did it, I'm out. Does do women have the same response to that concept of show up, produce, and die on time?
What do you mean by the response? Response for themselves or
In
response
terms
for
of
men?
the sense of empowerment, I feel empowered now. I'm showing up. That concept, the way you described it just now. Now that you positioned the way that you did, a lot of men will be able to identify with that, having a purpose, having a
Mm-hmm.
function, and going out in a blaze of glory, or whatever the case might be. Um, do women respond to that concept the way you just position it in the same way that men do?
Well, here's where I go off the rails and create enemies, and there'll be effigies burning of me in parks all over the country.
This is what I
Um,
do.
right, exactly. Um, I'll answer that in two ways. Right, none of them are evading the question. First and foremost, these three things resonate with men. At the end of the day, they don't resonate with most women. What resonates in this trilogy for women is why this trilogy is why women partner with men first and foremost. So they recognize that this is the role and job for men. It does not, however, resonate as strongly with them because their instincts are pointing at other things, other priorities, partnering, connecting, procreating, building and being. We speak a lot about men are human doings and women are human beings. And here,
Mhm.
right there, is the answer to your question as to how we resonate with this dynamic. I haven't really spent any time on the other side of it to say, well, do women have a trilogy? Do they have one thing? Do I have others? I've just gotten as far as this trilogy for men. So, in a way, they do respond to it, but only as it relates to why they partner with men, number one. And it does not, however, correspond to the bulk of their instinct, because I think a very good illustration of this is now that the US military and the Israeli military, for that matter, have opened up combat roles for women. You can look at the US, and very few women have actually signed up. It's literally like still single digits. And the ones who have signed up have not made it through. And a lot of it gets back to values, but obviously a lot of it gets back to the physical ability that is inherent in what they're discovering. So I hope that answers the question.
It does. It does. It's funny you hit on a topic that I was about to hit on, which is the men being viewed as human, women being viewed as human beings and treated as such, and not just from a social perspective, but from a legislative perspective,
Mm-hmm.
but men viewed largely as human doings. And
Right.
for those who don't really get the concept, a woman's value is in who she is as a person. A man's value is in what he does. If he doesn't produce, to your earlier point, he's not doing as a human doing. He's not of any value. That's the way people see it. He's being seen.
Mm-hmm.
So now we talked a bit about male disposability. Does it really exist? And can you give us some concrete examples of what male disposability is? I know you touched on it a little bit, but can you just delve into that a little bit more?
Well, when we look at 96 to 97% of workplace fatalities are men. When we look at 96, 97% of wartime fatalities are men. When we look at 85% of the layoffs that occurred basically during the last recession, going back to 2008, it's actually been nicknamed the man session because the layoffs were majoritively men. So as you begin to look around, I mean, I do respect that this is sort of a very difficult conversation for people to sort of jump into if they've not really been familiar with it, because, you know, we're raised in a culture that says, hey, you know, all life is valuable. We must value human life, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the irony is, to maintain that as a societal value, it requires that men be sacrificed for it. Because whether we like it or not, or whether certain people like it or not, a woman's value in terms of what she can produce is offspring. Without women, we don't have a society. Without women, we don't have a population. And, you know, we don't need as many men to keep things popping. One man can populate an entire nation. It doesn't work the other way around. And the more we try to deny the biological realities of this, and the more we also deny the reality that this equation exists in other creatures on this earth other than humans, we start to realize that this is not merely a political manufacture, but it's actually the way that societies of all creatures that have any kind of intelligence begin to formulate themselves. You know, there are matriarchies and there are ultimately patriarchies. And from a survival perspective, it's impossible, when you take a really serious, honest look at it, it's impossible to ignore that reality. So when we talk about, you know, in a shooting in a movie theater, who throws themselves on whom, right? Mm-hmm. So how often do you hear that the guy threw himself on his girlfriend to save her life? Now, there is an exception to this as it relates to women. They will throw themselves onto people / creatures, children, anyone that's less powerful than them, they will do that. But by and large, they're not going to do that, or shall I say, they're not going to make the move to do that to the men. The person that they perceive to be their protector, they're not going to move to be his protector. And there's ample evidence that that's so. So the dynamic of male disposability, even as it relates to, so if you look at the divorce courts, you know, well, we know that 85+% of children are assigned to the mother. And of course, some 85%+ of the people who pay child support and alimony are men. You know, we hear about these celebrities because there's so much money that maybe she's the more successful, but those are extremely, you know, extended exceptions to the rule. I have seen and I read about men who are on the hook for more than 100% of their income that must be paid out between child support and alimony. So that's another facet of male disposability, because one of the huge ramifications of that equation, when he is completely out of control, is male suicide. You know, on average, you know, we see that the male suicide rate is upwards to some 80% of suicides, and men in divorce, that equation actually goes even higher. That the men that will commit suicide based on their situation in divorce, it's getting close to almost be guaranteed that he's going to either harm himself or commit suicide,
or at least to
because
consider,
he's so out of control.
To consider making an attempt.
Exactly, right? So when we talk about male disposability, I think the only people who are surprised by it are people who are ideologically predisposed to not believe in it, or people who haven't been exposed to the concept. Otherwise, if you're an honest, awake person, you'll recognize that male disposability is the norm. I mean, you know, Spartan, either come back with your shield or on your shield.
Right.
And that's what life
300.
And that's what life looks like.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the only way that you're going to earn and maintain and gain respect is to be willing to lay that down to that degree.
Exactly.
So now, why is it that when we discuss men's roles, it's largely an intellectual, dispassionate conversation, but when we get into the same discussion about women's roles, the hair on the back of people's necks stand up? Why is that?
Try that question again, because it's a huge question. So, and there's a lot of facets to it. So ask me that again. Sorry.
So typically when we sit here and talk about men's roles, you know, here's a good example. If you've done any dating, even online dating. You know,
Mm-hmm.
you read the profiles. You know what a woman's looking for. If you're, you know, if you're heterosexual, you're dating. You know, looking for women. They have the laundry list. The laundry list is always the same list. It's practically copy and pasted the cookie cutter in every profile. You
Mm-hmm.
know,
Mm-hmm.
has a
Right.
job, does this and that. You know, and we all know that. We all know that every guy knows the checklist, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so, and I have this thing that I do when I'm meeting somebody, I'm dating them. We'll talk about that checklist. I'll say, you know, what is it that
Mm-hmm.
you see in me that you're attracted to, right? I mean, other than, okay, maybe you think you know, you like what I look like, but it's always more than that. You know, men are a little more visual than women. Women have other characteristics that are more important to them. I mean, good looking is one
Got
thing,
it.
but
Mm-hmm.
there's other stuff that's a higher priority.
Right.
So it's always an intellectual conversation. It's like, oh yeah, well, you know, your father, and you seem like a really good father, and you have a good job, and you can string together a sentence, you know, without any difficulty, and you don't live in your mama's basement, and whatever, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The same stuff you always hear. So what I then do is I turn the conversation around. I say, okay, well, so it seems like some of the checklists that are important to you, you feel that you check those boxes off for me. Those are the things I bring to the table. What do you bring to the table? And when I ask that question, I ask the question like that. What do you bring to the table? The question's like, what do you mean? Like what?
Do you
And
bring
and it
donuts?
gets right, right. But what happens is it becomes awkward immediately,
Yes.
and then although we're both speaking the same language, it's like I'm speaking in Mandarin because they instantly don't understand the question. I
Mm-hmm.
asked it a couple times, and what typically they're doing is they're stalling to try to think about what's he asking. Like I don't understand what he's
Right.
asking me. I said, well,
Right.
you know,
Okay.
you got my checklist. What's your checklist? And then it
Right.
becomes an awkward conversation. It stops being intellectual and dispassionate. Now it becomes one where she's starting to get offended. I guess my
Beautiful.
question to you is: have you come
Yeah.
across that? And if you have, why do you think that is?
Well, thank you for teasing that out because I didn't get the angle of it the first time through, but you did a brilliant job of illustrating it the second time through, and yeah, and get those double donuts ready. Um, it's and again, I can definitely say it's an absolutely huge question, and of course I've experienced it, and it's also that dichotomy of experience and that dichotomy of expectation was a powerful informant to this trilogy that I realized. Because at the end of the day, it is the man's job to produce. It is not her job to produce, right? And it is the man's job to show up. It is not her job to show up, right? So if I can make it in ultimately as simple a terms as that, that's what's informing that. And she's driven by her instinct. It's rare the woman who can actually articulate that. But the reality is, her instinct is 110% aware that this is the way it needs to go, because ultimately, what's her priority? Her priority is, am I going to be with a man who has the capability, who has the surplus resources to be able to afford while I can't work, to be able to afford me while I can't work, while I'm vulnerable and with child, and ultimately after I've delivered this child, is does he have the surplus resources to keep us all happy, safe, and warm? And that's really all her questions are about. And that's really, and ultimately, she only brings that one thing to the table. Now, is that a true statement? It's a mostly true statement. She can bring wisdom. She can bring intelligence. But at the end of the day, in the same way that they only want us to produce, she could care less about your smile. She could care less about how handsome you are. Those are bonuses for her. All
Yep.
she cares about is your bank account. And it took me a long time to get that. That's not necessarily a bad thing. And I think what we've tried to do conversationally is we've tried to make that a bad thing because there's the pretense of equality that then buries the dynamic that it is the man's job to produce. It is the man's job to provide, because if you look at the statistics of the divorces that are filed, upwards to 75% of the divorces filed are filed by women.
By women. That's right.
And the majority of those cases are not filed because of domestic violence, and they're not filed because of infidelity. The majority of them are filed because she now makes more money than he does.
Or has
When
access
I
to more
came
resources
across,
than he does, than he provides.
and usually what happens when it happens over time, the instant she makes more money is when she files for divorce, right? Because she obviously she could see it coming. And I actually was having a conversation with a very famous science fiction writer that I know, and I told him that story, and he said, that's exactly what happened to my neighbor. The instant she made more money, she was gone, or he was gone, however you want to phrase it. So the reality is, you know, historically, because survival was much more close at hand prior to this generation, like if you made a mistake, your survival was directly harmed. You might literally starve. You might literally be mauled by wild animals. You had to be really careful. Women brought more roles to the relationships. But now with equality, there is absolutely no social contract that women have to bring to any relationship anymore. They are not accountable to anything. They're not accountable for paying for anything. They're not accountable for working. They're not, you know, there's no shame brought if she's not working. Only, of course, by, you know, sadly by feminists, you know, oh, you're not working, how dare you? You know, we don't like that choice, therefore that's a bad choice, but that's another conversation.
It is.
Which is stunning to me, how that, you know, how they actually get away with that. But, you know, the role for men, this is why I realize how simple that role for men is because we can't escape it. No matter how much rhetoric is going on in the popular culture, if men stopped producing, the entire society would stop producing. I think one of the biggest tell-alls was the big protest, the Day Without Women. Now, I know that I, and probably yourself, predicted that nothing would happen. Nothing would change.
I actually predicted it, and I posted it online. I said, nothing will change. You won't even notice
Nothing will change, right?
And it wasn't me being mean. It was like, literally, you won't notice it.
Right, exactly. That's exactly right. So the Day Without Women happened, and there was only one caveat that I'd heard about, and I kind of agree, but it made sense. The only caveat was that the only role that women play in society that would actually have an impact would be nurses, because nurses actually do have a life and death responsibility, and their role is to make sure that people in hospitals are okay. And what was interesting was that literally nothing happened. Guys that their wives / girlfriends were on marches and they're getting pedicures and off at the spa. All they did was slightly arrange their schedule a little bit differently. They were still able to get the kids to soccer practice on time. They were able to go shopping, and it was literally no big deal.
It took the day off, basically. It was just a day off of work.
It was, and they had an easier time. Uh-oh, I'm still good. I got to go turn the lights on. They're on a timer.
Okay, go ahead. Go for it. I can edit this part out.
Oh, wait. Oh, wait, motion detector.
There you go.
It works.
Just going to move every once in a while. We'll keep you moving. Don't worry.
So, sorry about that.
Seventh inning stretch.
Right, exactly. You got to get up and stretch every now and then. It's good for your heart, too, by the way. So, so basically, by and large, there's no crucial role in terms of the motion of the entire society that women carry in terms of it being a bottom line dynamic, other than basically having children. And if, because we talk about female employment, but there isn't a lot of flag waving for female employment in the dirty and dangerous professions. I remember I was driving by these linemen, literally linemen, because I marveled. I looked up, and they're hanging from trees, and they're hanging from the poles, and they're dealing with these 100,000 volt, giant 2-3 inch cables. And there wasn't. I said, and there's not a feminist around.
Not a purple feminist in sight. Yeah.
So I kind of do. I mean, I kind of do take I'm making fun of you kind of angle, because it is. I really find a lot of their premises is so ridiculous. But there's no female undersea welders. There's very few female firemen. I have a cousin who's a fireman. She's a paramedic fireman, but she's like the only woman in like the entire district. And
oil rig workers. How many do you run into that are oil rig workers?
Right, exactly. Who aren't carrying a clipboard. For some reason. So I take that very seriously, because, while there's this battle to get more women in the office, in the nice air-conditioned office that's maintained by men down in the basement, they're not fighting for women to become, garbage collectors. They're not fighting for women to be, really, they're not really fighting for women to be firemen or any other dangerous
loggers, fishers, construction workers, highway repair workers.
Yep, construction workers. Nope. Mm-hmm. And I think that matters, and I think that's one of those things that are willfully ignored in this overall conversation. Because if the men that run the infrastructure disappeared, it would literally be at the end of Atlas Shrugged, that we would all wait for the clock in Times Square to stop running.
Right. Mm-hmm. I mean, there was a documentary. I think I saw it a couple years ago, and it said, "What would happen to the world if people disappeared? If there was no people one day, what would happen?" And the entire the entire documentary focused on infrastructure, focused on the fact that the devices that clean the water would stop working. You couldn't drink clean water. Lights would eventually go off. This roads would quickly find themselves and disappear. Bridges would fall apart. And these were all things that we can see, touch, and interact with. That when you, to your earlier point, when you look at the people that you see that work in those fields, there is the vast majority of those people are men. You know, they didn't talk about, would somebody make posts on Facebook? I mean, the power go out, Facebook would be a non-issue, or YouTube would be a non-issue. It's like the power's not even on. So when you were talking about that just now, that's the image that popped into my mind. It's like literally everything would just stop. And I think that just said something like along the lines of within a month, I think it was within a month or within the 2 months, people will start dying because food wasn't getting produced. It wasn't being properly cleaned and distributed. People just literally start to die. I mean, if you watched, that crazy series, The Walking Dead, that's what would happen. Minus the zombies, but food would disappear, resources would disappear. And you notice when you watch that series, not getting too far into it, but you look at the roles that people naturally fall into in that series. And what role do the men fall into, and what role largely you have the one or two women, of course, because you have the girl power women in the show, but the women largely fall into a certain role, and they fall into a role that men and women fell into 150, 200 years ago. It's interesting how instantly in that fictitious apocalypse, we fall back into default positions, and the social structures that we have set up that represent equality quickly disappear.
That's exactly right. I mean, we get that this conversation of equality is a manufactured conversation, because when you really look at it, equality is a difficult conversation. I mean, it started off as a conversation about equality under the law, which I think was wonderfully appropriate. But then when we started to force our thinking around what is equal, was when we began to go off the rails, and dangerously off the rails, because to your point, I must confess, I keep saving that show for when I have time, and I haven't had the time. However,
The Walking Dead?
The Walking Dead. However, I have watched many episodes of Bear Grylls' Survival Island, and where they split up the men and the women. And I think that sort of serves exactly the same purpose, because it's such a brilliant illustration about the difference in the capabilities in severe circumstances, and what happens to the psyche of men, and what happens to the psyche of women when they're in those situations. And I think that it's very telling, because the results, they've done it in Sweden, they've done it in Australia, they've done it in the UK, and I think they've done it in probably 4 or 5 other places around the world. And the results have all been exactly the same. The guys are out there having a brilliant time, literally building like hotels with elevators and hot tubs out of like shrubs and logs. And the women literally sort of cower under trees and hope they don't get wet at night. And then they pretty much starve to the point that they have to be taken off the island. No foresight, nothing. And usually what happens too is another interesting dynamic, is that there's usually 1 or 2 women who is competent in the woods, and the other women don't want anything to do with her. They overrule her, they push her out, and I'm sure that if it was real, they would take a stone and crush her skull.
Which fell asleep, yeah.
Yeah, and that to me is ultimately what ends up happening. So we start to get into the touchier dynamic of capabilities, and the more that I look at capabilities, the more that I get how literally explosive of a conversation that it is, because it's hard to say, but I can kind of sum it up this way: that most women are not interested in more accountable roles. They're just it's not in their instinct, whereas men are actually energized by being in accountable roles.
So let me get to that. I was going to ask the question. So this is the question, because you're getting there. So let me just make certain we kind of there is method behind my madness. So
perfect.
Here's the question: what is the difference between outcome and accountability, and why is it that feminists focus solely on outcome but dislike the topic of accountability? And why is it such a contentious topic? You were just about to get into it, but I want to make certain that we really crystallize that particular discussion point.
Right. It's the difference between an attitude of self-reliance and an attitude of collectivism. So when you look at the history of feminism, we know that it's an offshoot of Marxism.
Hmm.
And Marxism relies on the sort of the collectivists to produce very specific outcomes. It's also, in my view, an admission of an inability to produce results. So if we look at a population that is relatively low compared to men in terms of what they're capable of producing, we begin to see that if you know that you're not capable of producing something, you're going to have to skew the net results. Because if you know that the people that produce the most are going to get to consume the most, and you realize that you're going to starve to death unless you somehow get your finger on that scale, I think the answer is pretty clear that they know that. I mean, even when we look at productivity rates between men and women in terms of situations where they have to produce, let's take a look at the stats that they're finding out in the military right now. For example, they know that women are experiencing a 50% injury rate in training versus a 17% injury rate for men in training consistently. Israel already has these numbers, and the numbers work out exactly the same, right? When we look at, there's a great video probably YouTube, of course, where these 3 or 4 police women are trying to tackle down this guy that they were trying to arrest. It took 4 women to fail miserably to be able to tackle down this guy. And it wasn't until a guy bystander came in and tackled this guy down were they able to finally put handcuffs on him.
Right.
Now let's look at the cost of this scenario. How many men might it have taken to land that guy? On average, it probably would take about 2 because when perpetrators we know are pretty wiry and they're pretty strong. It's kind of hard to do it with one person, but on average it
Right.
would be 2, right?
Hmm.
So we now have to go through not just 2, but 4 people who had to be trained, 4 people that had to be equipped, 4 people that had to, be injured in training and then recover from all that. So now we've literally
4
doubled
salaries,
our
basically.
expenses, 4 salaries, and it's municipal, so we know that they're getting paid the same as the guys. So we've at least doubled the cost of fielding those 4 officers versus female officers versus the 2 men, to have them be completely incapable of actually getting the job done. If you were one of those 4 women, or if you were all 4 of those women, and it came time to give out pensions or some kind of award for productivity, and you knew that you were not going to get that award, I think the motivation would be to focus on outcomes, forced outcomes, versus capability. It's a hard conversation, and I really respect that. But it's also reality, and that cannot be ignored to anybody's benefit.
Right. Exactly. All right. We touch on a lot of really. I mean, we could take this conversation into 1,000 directions and go on for
Indeed.
hours. But and I would really love to do other shows with you, McCall. I mean, this is. I'm just fascinated listening to this. This is. I eat this stuff up. So. Before we go, though, is there anything that you want to add or anything you want to plug before we wrap up here?
I would say that we are, in fact, facing a crisis for men. And I think it's a very severe crisis. And I think that the popular conversations are looking completely in the wrong direction. By and large, the solution in the popular culture is, oh, the problem is men need to be more like women. But we're discovering the severe health situations that befall men when they are removed from environments where their testosterone can actually, exist, and they become weak, men become sick, and men become lost with no mission to accomplish. And as a result, we're looking at massively high suicide rates. We're looking at men literally leaving society. When men don't have a mission, we leave society. We don't just become stay-at-home dads. We literally leave society when we can't produce.
Withdraw.
We withdraw because there's no mission, there's no purpose, there's nothing to do that's greater than ourselves. And men need that as an instinct, as a piece of our survival instinct. So my parting sort of thoughts are, men really begin to investigate for yourselves because the information is out there. It might not be, safe or popular for you to pursue it, but I would encourage men to individually identify what drives them. You know, learn about Myers-Briggs and their personality types. Learn about the role of testosterone. Nova did a brilliant documentary on testosterone and what it does and all the surprising things that they found out about it. I mean, you know, we talk about toxic masculinity when at the same time, testosterone in men is half of what it was in 1970, right?
Yep.
So we talk about toxic masculinity and violence when you recognize that testosterone actually produces the ability to modulate your violent reactions. So it's exactly up. So with lower testosterone, of course, violence is going to go up, and we can cover what's going on in Chicago as a massive, or Philadelphia for that matter, as a massive illustration of what I'm getting at. So there's that. So I would encourage men to really sort of step away from the popular culture and the popular messages that are encouraging men to be more like women, and really get back into the literature that does exist out there that really defines on a literal and specifically a mythological level. Because I think there's a lot of answers to be found in myth and mythology about what drives men, what fuels men, what sustains men, and what has men be able to prosper and ultimately provide for themselves and make their own needs a priority, right? Because that's another thing that we sort of betrayed ourselves as our own priorities, and we were so willing to sacrifice ourselves to everybody but ourselves.
Our own happiness and everything.
It's a huge falling down that men need to really embrace. And we need to really embrace these three things in a serious way. Show up, produce, and die on time. It's actually, ironically, good news. So I say, think on those things and look for ways to make a difference. Look for ways to show up in society once again. It might not be an easy journey, but it'll be worth it. And they can write me. They can look me up and contact me through instituteforadultcommunication.com. You can find me under Institute for Adult Communication on Facebook. Sign up, join in, and they can also inquire about the multiple programs, you know, that we have: one-on-one programs, group programs, and our online programs. So there you go.
McCall, thank you so much. I'm going to add the links to each of those, your website, your Facebook, and the other links that you sent to me. I'll put those in the low bar so people can get access to them. And I'll make certain as I produce this in different sections when I do post-production that it's in the low bar for each of the episodes. Listen, I've been dying to have a show like this with you, McCall. We are definitely going to have to do other shows. I mean, if you're up for it, I'm up for it. This is fantastic. It was fantastic. I learned from your posts. I learned listening to you. It's energizing. I really enjoy it. Thank you so much again for joining us, McCall. All right.
Totally welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. If you enjoyed the show and want to see more, follow our Facebook page called The Man Cave by Gentlemen United. Thanks again for joining us in The Man Cave.